but we're excited to be here. I will hand things over to our moderator, Tyrell. Tyrell, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. I think you might be muted, sir.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here with the esteemed panelists that we have today. Thank you for the introductions of us. Today I have with us Tanya Rumbo, who's the Director of Development at Ryerson University, as well as Mariya who's the CEO and president of a recruiting firm. We're really looking forward to today's conversation, which talks about the need for diversity within AI and the nonprofit sector. So we'll dive right in since we're already being introduced. So the first question I really want to propose to the group to really set the stage on this conversation on why we need diversity within the AI and nonprofit sector is really to tell us a little bit more about what diversity means to them. And then that will kind of segue into a lot more questions about the need for diversity within the AI and nonprofit sector. And I will have Tanya answer the first question.
Sure. Well, really happy to be here. Thank you to Fundmetric and Acadia University for inviting us to be a part of this panel. I'm very passionate about equity, diversity, inclusion, and more broadly and more deeply power and privilege and how that shows up in the nonprofit fundraising and philanthropic sectors. For me, diversity is sort of, any dimension that can be used to differentiate yourself from groups or people. In a nutshell, for me, it's about empowering people by respecting and appreciating what makes them different in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, education, country of origin. And I think for today I see diversity in like the context of an iceberg. So I see things like race, religion, gender, and ability as that visible portion of the iceberg. And the conversation that we're having around equity, diversity, and inclusion is really about moving deeper and underwater into the more invisible forms of diversity, things like sexual orientation, neurodiversity, class, socioeconomic status. But if we can't first sort of address the things that are visible in our communities and our organizations, it really signals to people that the traits and identities that they hold, that they don't have to share, it's best to keep them invisible. So that's how I sort of see diversity today.
Thank you for that. That was interesting how you talked about intersectionality and then the two different types of being visible and non-visible. That'd be interesting to come back to as we're having that discussion, how intersectionality plays in deepening the relationships with our donors and also just building community. So that'd be interesting to come back to. Mariya, what about you?
Thanks, Tyrell. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Mark and Acadia University for hosting us today. I think that I approach this from an equal passion, except maybe a different angle than Tanya does. And to me, it's all about, it goes back to the reason why I started my career and dedicated my career to the nonprofit sector to begin with. And that is because it allowed me to see the best in people when they're interested in helping others, separating with their wealth to create a better world for everyone else. But in doing so, we can only do that if we create an environment where everyone is included and everyone has an equal chance in participating and taking advantage of the systems that we've created in society. And I think that when it comes to diversity, we have a long way to go in many of these aspects. And I just think of how much more we can accomplish and how much more successful we can be, either as organizations or as, cities, countries, world, if you wish, if we actually brought everyone to the table and gave everyone in every perspective an equal opportunity to participate in the work that we do. I think that we've sort of sidelined so many different identities or intersectionalities that I think if we create a world where we can bring more people to the table. Science already shows more diverse teams are better performing. Organizations with more diverse boards end up better on their stocks, any financial metric you can think of. So we know the benefits are there, but I think we need to work a little bit harder to make sure that everyone is invited to the table and has an equal chance of participating. So that's the perspective that I take And I look at this, as Tanya was talking about the iceberg, a lot of the work that I do is in talent recruitment when it comes to the nonprofit sector. And I think of this a bit more as a pipeline. And I think we're currently at the stage where we're thinking of that visible portion of the iceberg and who's on boards and who's in leadership positions, but we're not thinking about everybody else and how do we create a pipeline to ensure that we're not asking ourselves this question 10, 20 years from now. So that's some of the motivations I have to be here today.
Thank you for that. I think you brought up a couple good points. I think inclusion and participation is definitely good when looking at the scheme of things in terms of DEI, both diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think you have to tackle each one of those differently in its own right. But I think tackling diversity first helps to kind of hit the domino effect on the other two. And I think one thing as well as that you talked about, which is really good, and I think that's something we can talk about once building that community and also staffing and recruiting, is really that diversity of thought. I think that's really where organizations thrive, is having diverse opinions, diverse perspectives. That really helps one build community, helps you to see the other perspective on different individuals, which allows you to have more empathy once you're tackling different problems. So I think diversity of thought is really a good way to frame things as we're talking about diversity within both organizations, as well as how we're talking to our donor bases, which is the end goal within some of this. So thank you both for those two thoughtful answers. I think a lot of that will correlate to some of the follow-up questions that I plan on asking. So now that we have kind of set the stage on what diversity means to you, why do you think there's a need for diversity within AI in the nonprofit sector?
I can start us off, Tyrell. I mean, exactly to what Mariya's articulated. I think organizations can be diverse without being inclusive. And because inclusion is just not a natural consequence of having a diverse team or organization. And I think having diverse nonprofit and charitable organization means differences exist. And then inclusion really takes it forward to ask, how does everyone from team members to end users and the beneficiaries that are benefiting from the funds that are raised in your organization, how do they feel valued? And so I would suggest that we need diversity and inclusion in AI and the nonprofit sector, because I think both are lacking. I think there's a bit of context here that we can set. 68% of charities have seen a decline in donations since the outset of the pandemic. 46% of charities are reporting an increase in demand. As a result, charities are being stretched to do even more through their service capacities have either declined or remained about the same. Unfortunately, more than a third of Canadian donors say COVID will cause them to give less. Social uprisings around the world are demanding that charities address things like racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. 70% of people working in fundraising identify as women. However, where are the racialized women, Indigenous women, queer women, differently abled women, trans women, and newcomer women represented in leadership roles? A recent StatsCan survey reported that only 11% of individuals serving on a board of a charity or nonprofit identified as racialized, 8% identified as LGBTQ2+, 6% identified as a person with that was differently abled, and 3% identified as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. That's a Canadian stat. So we have Canadians giving less. Charities who provide direct service are seeing increased demand. And so that often means turning to technology and automation to reduce payroll expenses. It just is what it is. And so when we're pairing that with a dearth of diversity, both in senior leadership roles and in governance, there's a real risk that AI and machine learning will be designed by and for the dominant group. So AI and machine learning perpetuate the existing biases that exist in our human resources. Like, just because it's not inherently an objective system. There are people inputting into AI, into machine learning. I did a postgraduate degree at NYU, and the NYU AI Now Institute published a seminal study that found that more than 80% of AI professors are men. Only 15% of AI researchers at Facebook and 10% of AI researchers at Google are women. And the numbers reflect an issue facing the computer sciences. So in 2018, less than 25% of PhDs were awarded to females and minorities who are historically underrepresented in computing. And so that impact is then going to get compounded. So we intend for AI to have this multiplying effect in our organization and our work to sort of expand the reach of what we don't have the human resources to do. And so you can really see how this lack of diversity and inclusion in the workforce and leadership positions in charities, as well as in the people that are designing AI systems and machine learning, are going to end up having those same unconscious biases and those same blind spots that are going to end up being embedded in these technology solutions that are intended to provide reach and expand the resources of the nonprofit sector. So I think it's a huge, huge, huge risk. I think we have this real opportunity now to design systems that work, that are free as much as possible from bias, that are free as much as from oppression and oppressive points of view. And I think if we don't get it right now, what we're going to be is in the same situation as the nonprofit sector more broadly, where today there's this reckoning. Like, we started as the philanthropic community, this love of humanity, but of whose humanity? Racialized organizations serving and led by racialized individuals receive the lowest amount of funding in North America. So again, we're going to end up with creating these systems that we think, they're going to help us, just like charities and nonprofits were intended to fill the gaps that government was not fulfilling. And we end up with these systems that just have biases baked right into them.
Thank you for that great answer. Mariya?
How do I follow that? So here's where I was going with this. I think Tanya and I wrote a piece for Advancing Philanthropy last year called Swept Under the Rug. And in the work that I do and in my personal development, I try to explore the issues of power and privilege a lot, and sort of explore how that's affected me in my life, and also how do I see this in every aspect of my professional life. And the way I see this is that in the nonprofit sector, we tend to sort of aspire to uphold this pristine image of we are the good guys and gals. We are, this do-good sector. There's still the very big misconception among some of our donors that, most of us should be able to do this kind of work for free without having to support ourselves. And we're doing this because we're so passionate about the causes that we advance. And then, so anytime there is an issue or a problem in our industry that may tarnish that image, even if just a little, we tend to sweep it under the rug and not talk about it, not explore this. And I feel that the issues around diversity is one that we can't do that with. We cannot sweep this under the rug. We cannot continue to think that we are the good guys and gals, and that we're advancing society through the causes that we all participate in, without thinking about all of the pieces around, racial Black Lives Matter reckoning, if you wish, but issues of inclusion when it comes to the LGBTQ community, et cetera. Unless we address that, I think all of the work that we do to advance those causes is always going to be stunted in growth and in impact, because it will be inherently biased based on the people that participate in the work that we do. And the other aspect of this is that something that I'm keenly interested in is sort of what experience are we presenting to our donors? And, this is a debate that I'm sure we can have in the AI Forum conference, but I spent my early years in fundraising sort of working in annual giving and segmenting data and trying to figure out who's most likely to give. And Tyrell, you probably know this yourself, a lot of the data that we rely on to make those decisions is people's previous behavior. And so you can see how if you have a very homogenous fundraising team that's come up with fundraising programs that are not particularly culturally appropriate or inclusive, they have inspired a certain proportion of our donors that is very homogenous. And now when you run an AI algorithm on it, what bubbles to the top is the same kinds of behavior. The reality is that, as much as we think we have free will and as much as we would like to think that we're inspiring donors to give, the reality is that we train donors to give. We educate them on our causes. We prompt them with our campaigns. And, there's a reason why people like to give in December. And it's not to do with, just generally the holiday spirit, if you wish. It's more because we ask a lot in December or whatever your schedule is. So if we have this system that's built with so much bias in it, we need to figure out a way to break that chain, because otherwise we're never going to figure out a way to have an inclusive fundraising world, if you wish, and inspire donors of a variety of lived experiences. So, and that requires a lot of people with a diversity of lived experiences on the AI and engineering side to think about those issues when those algorithms and programs are created to break that chain. So another example I can give you is in the work that we do as major gifts officers, for example, wealth and capacity to give is the number one way that we explore who we need to focus on. And the primary indicator for that is, for example, your postal code or how much your house is worth. And Tanya and I could talk for hours about the inherent bias in that particular number and how that could be preventing us from engaging with a number of different people who may not necessarily have benefited from the wealth of having inherited their house or increased house value. I feel like Mark wants to say something, but I'll pass it over and I'll stop here.
Well, I think that was the point I was going to bring up. First of all, for those who don't know, because I don't know if I've said it, I do have cerebral palsy and identify as somebody with a disability. So just so the cards are on the table, so to speak. But I think these issues are issues that need to be discussed in general. Bias in artificial intelligence is very real, and it is something that we struggle with, at Fundmetric, and we try and be very cautious. But it does go down to the underlying teams that build this. As Tanya said, I do think there is the opportunity. I mean, speaking bluntly, relative to the technology available, nonprofits typically have very bad data. And when I say bad data, what I mean is it's incomplete, it's noisy, it's not in the same format, not necessarily bad in other contexts, but they don't have the greatest data. The opportunity that presents machine learning in particular is to bring everybody up. So one of the things that you can do is you can start with everybody. And this gives you a baseline to at least start from. And it doesn't mean that you don't have to address the systemic issues of getting more diversity in artificial intelligence and in computer science in general. You do. And that's something we're very proud to be kind of leading here. But I think what it means is also there is an opportunity to train a different generation of machine. And if we don't take that opportunity now, collectively as a society, we're going to miss that opportunity. There are very few industries that are in that pioneering phase as much as machine learning. The other thing that you can do is, of course, program towards inclusivity. So based on what somebody is doing is one thing, but giving that equal opportunity is incredibly important. And you could train a machine very easily to go find people who aren't given the opportunities. So you can actually apply this backwards using the training data, and the bad data works better. Because instead of looking for what you have, the traditional patterns, you actually teach it to look for what's not there. There's way more examples of it. And so in doing that, you can then pull out other information. I think when you talk about the above the iceberg and below the iceberg, that's where we really do have some shortfalls. But I will tell the audience, you have two of the best professional writers. They have created 5 articles that I constantly reference. And you also have Tyrell on this call, who has implemented artificial intelligence very successfully and understands I think some of the challenges with it and some of the opportunities. So this is during the networking lunch, during some of those places, some of the ways that you can connect with some of the tangible things that you guys have done. You can read. I'm not going to ramble on here too much longer, but the tangible advice that are in the papers that these folks have written is absolutely something that opened my eyes to a different way of hiring and to try and tackle some of these issues. Tyrell, or I'll hand it back to someone else.
Thank you for that additional context, Mark. I think one common thread that came across, I think, through everything that the three of you were speaking was really the diversity of thought and how that really helps to influence not only staffing, but also the systems and processes that are in place that influence how we talk to this growing demographic of people, whether that's from a diversity lens, an equity lens, or inclusion lens, how we're talking to this growing demographic that in the long run affects the bottom line of how we talk to our donors. Because with most organizations, we've been tapping into the same well, so to speak, with major gifts, with some of the annual giving different levels. Now we're trying new tactics to really get new people in the fold and new demographics in the fold that are going to help us build that pipeline for future major gifts down the road. So I think diversity of thought plays a huge factor in both the staffing components as well as systems and the processes that are in place that influences how we're using AI and some of the other different tangibles to talk to the people within these different sectors. I think that's a good segue into a conversation we had in preparation for this, which I think goes back to building community, the diversity of thought, different perspectives. And, as we talk to prepare for this conversation, we all found that community plays a critical role within this discussion. How should organizations be intentional about creating community for diverse professionals that are trying to get into the field within AI and the nonprofit sector?
I can start us off a little bit on that one. I mean, intentionality, I think you've said it right there, Tyrell. It's really being intentional about this is something that is core to our culture and core to our mission. We cannot achieve our mission without the diversity of thought and perspective within our organization. And so from the perspective of hiring and talent recruitment, Mariya is the expert on that. But thinking about what do you really need? Is lived experience something that you're looking for? If so, value it, promote it, and make that front and center on a job posting. We are looking at people, yes, you've got to have the technical acumen, but we want you to bring that lived experience and we're going to pay you for that. Similarly, if you're working with volunteers and community members and trying to gain and benefit from those experiences and those perspectives, being really thoughtful about it and being really clear that you're willing to compensate people for that lived experience. Lived experience is just as valuable as professional experience, and we really need to start valuing it as such by compensating for it. I think one of the things I often think about and say is that when we're thinking about diversifying an organization or a community, people start to go, oh my goodness, should we have X amount? And it's about this checklist of we need someone that's queer, we need someone that's differently able, we need someone that's trans. It's not really, that's not going to work. And again, that goes back to diversity versus inclusion. So what I always think of is this idea that one person is a token, bringing someone that's Black or racialized into a group that's been largely dominated by white folks, that person's a token. 2 is an interest group. So you've got 2 people and they're like a little interest group on their own. Look, let's turn to them. And then 3 is where there can be collective change that can actually start to happen. I mean, if you look at boards of directors and senior leadership in organizations across some of the biggest nonprofits that are really starting to look into AI and use machine learning more robustly, how many folks are white, cisgender, men, as an example. And have we said, okay, that's too many, we can only have 2? If that was the case, we would look at those boards of directors, we'd look at those leadership teams and say, there's too few. And so we really need to think about collective change with the collective. So 1, token; 2, interest group; 3, you can start to get that collective change can start to happen. And I think the other piece that I would say is that you can only sensitize yourself and be aware of the things that you are aware of. And so, as much as you can try and teach a machine to look for things it doesn't know, you need to be able to know what you don't know. And so, sensitizing yourself to the lived experience of people that are the least like you is going to be the best way to do that. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but this is a journey that will never be over because intersectionality is so many layers. I am steeped in this work and I'm constantly learning about different perspectives that I just didn't think about because I do have certain privileges. Everyone is a collection of both the privileges that they have and the oppressions that they also have. And so I think it's really important to think about how do you keep that learning journey going and not just at the front end of setting up a system, but ongoing? Like, what's that testing process? What are you constantly stress testing? Do we have this perspective? What are some of the other ways that you can make sure that new and perspectives that you didn't consider have an opportunity to shift the way you build systems and how those evolve over time?
Mariya, any additional thing that?
I can talk about, talent recruitment and creating sort of a inclusive work environment for hours, but maybe I'll share a couple of misconceptions and sort of break this down for folks. So in the work that I do, particularly in the last year, many of my clients have come forward and said, we're really interested in attracting diverse candidates, and they use that term to imply racialized, differently abled, and members of the LGBTQ community, if you wish. And then my first question back is, and how ready are you to support someone like that in your environment? Like, are they going to be, as Tanya mentioned, are they going to be the first, the second, the third, the fifth? Like, what does that look like? How much training has your staff had around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace? Sort of what is your mentorship process, and sort of what professional networks are you able to support individuals with? And the biggest breakdown that usually happens is around qualifications, for example. So people still want someone who has tremendous lived experience, but also is just as credentialed and has the exact same professional experience as everybody else. And the issues around, advanced degrees comes up. Or another example I can give is around with the certified fundraising executive designation, for example, or having worked on $1 million gifts or any number of those things, not taking into consideration there's a number of systemic barriers there that are impeding individuals from being able to accomplish some of these things, not for lack of skill or talent, for example. So that's one of the misconceptions. And then the other one that I'm going to mention that is my greatest fear when I do this kind of work is around tokenization. And that really is, there's an expectation that, you would attract, let's pick a director of development who happens to be racialized, and all of a sudden they're going to lead your DEI strategy internally, and they're going to figure out how to diversify your donor base. And somehow they're going to be amazing at all the other things that come with the job. Oh, and by the way, you're going to pay them probably the same or slightly less at what you would pay if they were, a white male, for example. And that's just not realistic, and that just cannot happen. So breaking these down sometimes can take a while, but in the work that I do, what I try is to present a slate of candidates for my clients that is fairly balanced and well diverse, and break down the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves when it comes to qualifications, for example, and start them on the way of thinking of, here's what you need to do in order to support this individual through their professional journey. So an example, I work with a lot of small clients who don't have one or two fundraisers in the team, for example. And so the latest one, when I was doing a check-in, after a call with my executive director, I sent back, here's the list of professional organizations and groups and designations that you can support your staff with. And some of them, in that particular case, it was a woman of color who was in that position that needed support. So I sent her specific resources that could be used to support her as a racialized fundraising professional, which has another level of complexity all on its own. So being able to have access to those resources and recognize that there is a need for them, I think is the first step. But I'm going to shut up now because I know that we have a lot of questions to get through.
Tyrell, do you mind if I add just one quick additive comment?
Go ahead.
I just want to remind folks of two things. One, people are not diverse, communities are. So we're not looking for someone to hold all these identities in their one being. We're looking for a collective of people that have unique intersectional identities above that waterline and below that can come together. And to that point, if it seems like we're picking on white men, it's because white men in our community and in the Canadian context have the most privilege of any other demographic. Now, the one pushback that I often get from people who are willing to actually say this to me as a racialized woman is, will I have a place in this sector? Will I have work if I'm not diverse? And again, I say, people are not diverse, communities are. And if you are willing to dig into this work and you are truly committed to inclusion and to fostering inclusive nonprofit and charitable organizations, you will always have a place. But it's also important that people that have been highly underrepresented equally have an opportunity to have space, to take some power, and to offer the unique perspective that you're looking for that you don't always want to pay for.
Oh, great. Thank you for that additional insight. I think both what you and Mariya both talked about, I think the tokenization, I think, is something key that organizations have to look out. Being the one and only and being the voice for everyone, I think that happens a lot where you become the Black voice or whatever racial identity that you come from. I think they want you to be the voice of all of that. There's no way you can be the voice of every single one within your community. And I think I like the way how you said you come from a diverse community, not that the person is diverse. And I think that you have to take that into consideration as you're doing these different staffing. And I think support really plays a huge factor in that. I think not only it's important that you recruit diverse talent, but also once you get them there, that you're supporting them. And I think building that community, I think, helps a lot. So this kind of segues great into my next question. Creating this community is critical to nurturing a person's career, but also someone's spirit and resolve. Can you share why you feel it's important to find a community that encourages and supports you?
Doing a lot of the talking, but I think a lot of folks in the nonprofit sector, I think, have been feeling really disenfranchised. And so there's been an emergence of some incredible communities that have provided strength, solidarity, and a sense of shared belief and values around the work that we want to do in this sector and the transformation that we're seeking to create. So the community-centric fundraising is an incredible example of a group that's emerged in a really grassroots way to think about moving from this donor-centric model of fundraising into a community-centered approach, which also centers the beneficiaries of the funds that are being raised. And I think that's a perfect example of the kind of community that's needed and that's found a lot of people that are seeking that. For myself, I was really grappling with a colleague around this idea of power and privilege in fundraising. We're often, as fundraisers, feeling like we're in such a deficit role because we're seeking resources from someone who has it. But I think we sometimes forget that that person on the other side of the table or that organization also wants something that we have, an ability to achieve impact through the organization that we are representing, an ability to achieve their philanthropic objectives and to actually have the benefit of working with a credible organization to do that work that they couldn't do on their own. And so for me, it was about creating community. And so with a colleague, Nicole McMahon, we've created a philanthropy and equity community of practice. It's a brave space, not a safe space. I think bravery implies this idea that you're going to have to say things and lean into conversations that can be difficult rather than safety, which kind of implies that you'll be insulated from any potential harm. No, this work is hard and it's important conversations. And so it's a way to think about the practical implications of sharing power. How do microaggressions show up in fundraising and philanthropy? How do we value lived experience? And those are some of the conversations that we're having in our community of practice. And so for us, it was about creating that so that for folks like us who love fundraising, but we're feeling really imbalanced or feeling like the charitable sector wasn't doing enough to recognize some of the social challenges that exist in today's society. We wanted a place to have conversations about that and to think about how we can bring that back into our work with our colleagues, but also with our donors. How do we bring them on that journey with us? And so for me, it was about creating community. And I feel really grateful that I have that. And I've been able to work and partner with folks like Mariya to really have these conversations and to add some thought leadership to our sector around what EDI means and how it's expressed in annual giving, major giving, and everything in between.
Mariya?
Oh boy, this is an interesting one. So for me, talking about icebergs, I think it was last year around this time, I called Tanya one day and I was like, talked to a fundraiser across the country from another institution. And she asked me the most peculiar question. She's like, so Mariya, you're Eastern European and I'm Eastern European, and I've never met another Eastern European in fundraising. And so when you speak with an accent and I speak with an accent, and I've never really met anyone that speaks with an accent in fundraising. So like, how did you make it? Like, do you sometimes feel like you are not what people expect to see from a fundraiser? And I called Tanya, I was like, gosh, like if I and people that look and sound like me feel that we're somehow not what people expect, then like what's the rest of the world to do, right? And so that led me to on a sort of a bit of a journey around, how can I use my power and privilege in this to raise these questions and lean into this kind of work so that no one, regardless of sort of their position in the organization or their experience, can feel like they're not seen, or they can't see leaders that look and sound like them, for example, or feel like we're somehow less than and not what our donors expect to interact with. And I think that this is probably my pet peeve, but like in the world of particularly in major gifts, like we spend the majority of our time assuming what our donors think, want, instead of actually talking to them. We call this strategizing, but really it's just us making assumptions. And so I think that we also need to give some of our donors a little bit of credit, that we're not all of a sudden go to disenfranchise a whole bunch of people and be like, you know what, like we would like people who don't look like you. And I'm talking about, let's say, people with significant privilege and who are white. And all of a sudden they're going to be like, see ya, we don't really care about your cause. I don't think that that's the case. I think that many of them actually do want to engage and help our organizations and are on their own journey. And I think we have a responsibility as fundraisers to lead them on that journey and have a knowledge exchange and come from a position of balance, I would say, referring back to what Tanya was talking about, instead of this like, we're beholden to their check on an annual basis perspective. So I think we have a little more power, but we need to have these discussions internally with ourselves, with our teams, with our organizations, to get to the point where we can have them with our donors. I think in some of the spaces that Tanya is creating are great if you want to think about doing things outside of your own organization, but I would encourage everyone to think about creating some of those spaces internally to have those discussions within your teams. And sometimes they're going to be artificial, and sometimes they're going to be real things that a donor said yesterday or said it to another organization that is currently in the newspaper. And how would you deal with it? I think we got to explore these before they actually happen to us.
I think, Mariya, also you hit on something really valuable there. I think that you said when we're strategizing, we're making assumptions. And I actually think that's where data and machine learning has an opportunity to add value. Instead of us saying, this is what happened, therefore this person's probably not a prospective supporter, let's capture those interactions. Let's think about how we can move our bias from the equation and just track, what happened, what was the outcome, and start to see if there's some patterns that emerge that we might not see otherwise if we were making assumptions. Because our brain really likes pathways it knows. It likes to go to the place it's already been. And so if we don't, use that opportunity to capture more objective data, I think that's where machine learning can allow us to think very differently about the relationships that we have and the future opportunities. Because one data point or one interaction shouldn't deter us from thinking about other ways of building that relationship or other ways of approaching a prospective supporter.
Yeah, I will just jump in and echo that. I think that that's awesome. And I think, one question I do see, and Ty, I'm kind of curious to get your perspective. I know you came in to moderate, but how do we educate the next generation, including diverse students who are seeking post-secondary options to join the fundraising sector? I think um, you are a co-chair of CASE and very involved in leadership, but you're also on the other side of the border. So there's some differences there. But how do you get new people? I know you've done a masterful job of it. So can you talk a little bit about the education? Sorry to spring it on you. I can't resist.
No worries. I think the biggest components of it is being intentional around the education pieces of that, and also I think it's the education on how it correlates to their day to day. I think a lot of times people get caught up in the word fundraising, philanthropy, but they don't realize that a lot of these different communities have been doing philanthropy or giving back in other ways. And actually, if you look at per capita, most diverse communities are giving more compared to other areas. They give their time, talent, and their treasure in different ways. So I think the more we're able to educate these different communities on there are other opportunities that exist that translate to stuff they're already doing, whether it's marketing, whether it's finance, whether it's advertising. There's different ways that people from diverse backgrounds can really get involved with fundraising. I think it first starts with the education process, and so that people can see that it's a viable career option. Because me coming out of college, I didn't see fundraising as a career option, much like most fundraisers. We kind of stumbled into it. I think now you're starting to see a little bit more intentionality around going into it, and I foresee programs like CASE with their graduate resident program and their internship program, which is really designed to increase diversity amongst the fundraising professionals throughout the U.S. and Canada. I think that's one way to really get into that, and I think you have to start to build that community or that network of people that you can educate about what fundraising is and what the impact that it can have. And I think that's the basis of a lot of it is the education process. And then from there, once you educate, I think that's where you start to see that people can see themselves within those positions, which goes back to, I think, the staffing components of that as well. You have to see people that look like you in those leadership positions. And if you don't have that, it makes it even harder for those people within those communities to get on board because they don't see people that are at the senior level, VP level, that look like them to get into that profession. So I think that's the one of the biggest things you have to look at. I think the education components, but also getting people that look like you within those leadership positions so that the people coming up can see themselves within that.
I know I sort of switched roles with you, so thanks for the insight because I was curious on your perspective, but I'll hand it back to you.
I know we have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to bring it full circle. I know in today's conversation, we talked about why diversity is important. We talked about building a sense of community amongst diverse professionals. Now I wanted to kind of bring it full circle where you're talking about the staffing, you're talking about the building the community, also the diversity, but how does that tie into creating community and having a domino effect on the bottom line of the organization in both the short and long term, which is about engaging your diverse constituents differently. So can the panelists really talked about how AI and increasing diversity amongst AI in the nonprofit sector can have a domino effect on how you're really outreaching to your donors?
I can maybe get us started there. So one of the clients that I work with, and I'm just going to give this one example, and then I'll pose the question and I'll pass it back to Tanya, is Muslim Liberal Arts College in California. And their entire fundraising model is based on the fact that during the month of Ramadan, the Muslim community is expected to donate 2.5% of their annual income to charity. And I asked the question, and Mark will probably give you lots of stats. If we were, and just imagine if a community that's that generous, that actually outgives, if I were to use that term, most other communities that are engaged in philanthropy, if we can bring them to the table and inspire them to give to the institutions that we represent, that we historically may not have, by doing things like hosting a wine and cheese event in the middle of Ramadan, real example here. So that in and of itself, I think, goes back to your point of it will affect the bottom line, because we're currently not exploring all the potential of all of the communities that are could be inspired by our organizations. So I think that's one aspect of this, and AI can definitely help with some of that, because it will, it can give us, as Mark talked about, it can give us an opportunity to figure out who's not at the table, and then we can think about how do we engage that group and bring them to the table. But the other piece of this, I think, is, as Tanya mentioned, going back full circle to the beginning, like things are not working. Like many organizations are seeing declines in their annual giving, for example, and sort of those typical traditional event fundraising, for example. So clearly we need to do something. And one of the reasons why we're seeing that decline is because we've created systems and programs that appeal to one particular donor who is no longer in their best giving years. Let's go with that. So we need to change, because otherwise we're going to experience decline all along.
I would add to that is this idea that like this is a long game, and I know that people are often, I know the pressure of being a fundraiser, and you're looking for things that are going to impact your bottom line this year. But I think that what you need to look at and balance is this idea that like if we don't engage in this work, that in the coming years we will not be well positioned to achieve our goals then. And we also need to invest in relationships before we request. That's just how it is. If the communities don't see themselves reflected in the mission of your organization and don't have an authentic relationship with you, it's going to be very difficult to translate that into an immediate fundraising ask. So building authentic relationships of mutual benefit at the outset before starting to say, can you host a gala for us? Can you write a check? I think is really, really important. It's a long-term strategy, just like AI and embedding machine learning into our organizations is not going to happen overnight. More and more, we will be investing in these technologies. More and more AI and machine learning will help us and support us in our work. It's not going to happen overnight. In the same way, we shouldn't expect relationships with new communities that we haven't previously had an authentic relationship with are not going to materialize in terms of fundraising goals and objectives overnight as well. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you both for those thoughtful answers. We could go on for days about this topic. I think it's something that's much needed. You know, we have 45 minutes, which is only the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on this conversation. But definitely appreciated the conversation between you two. And it's I advise everyone to take nuggets from this and start to apply that to your day-to-day. Ask those questions about your organization so that they can be intentional about their process with the staffing components, the processes, the systems, so that moving forward that, they're putting a diversity lens and also an equity and inclusion lens on how they're going about changing their processes and staffing and systems to really target this new demographic of donors that we're seeing, because it is eventually going to affect their bottom line, as both of them talked about. So glad that we're able to talk to you about the need for diversity within AI in the nonprofit sector. And hopefully we'll see some of you throughout the conference the rest of the week. Thank you.